Hey there. Today I want to talk about the monster that everybody loves or everybody loves to complain about, which is the vampire. So I just finished Fevre Dream by George R.R. Martin, and it made me really start thinking about all the different ways that vampires are presented. Vampires have been around for centuries, but they keep evolving into all these different kinds of things. They're never really the same monster. We have like the really grotesque, monstrous one of Nosferatu, and then we have these more like predatory, seducing ones. And then we have, ones that want to be the hero, like in Blade, or ones that are the romantic love interest, like in Twilight. So they keep taking on all these different forms. And we get into these arguments, or at least I see these arguments a lot, about people saying, like, they don't want vampires this way or that way. They want vampires to go back to being scary. They don't want moral vampires. They don't want sexy vampires. And we get into these arguments about, like, what's the best vampire. But I really don't think that that's the interesting argument. I think that the interesting argument about vampires is their versatility and where that's all coming from and why we have all these different changes in the vampire and what those changes are really about. I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to use Fevre Dream since I just read it and it made me think about this a lot as an example for some of this. I'll use other examples too, but just so you know, if you want to read Fevre Dream, I thought it was really great. It's totally worth the read, but I am going to spoil it in this. So if you don't want the spoilers, then just, go read it and then come back. First, I just want to talk about the different evolutions of the vampire that I've noticed, at least. And we can start out really with the vampire as the monster. We can say this is stage one. And the vampires are just going to symbolize different things in each stage, or especially different fears. So I think that's the big thing. The vampires are always changing and evolving because they're representing different fears that we have at different times, and even sometimes different desires that we have, or just like struggles that are competing in our minds at different points in time. So again, the first one is the monster. This is the gross one, like Nosferatu, the vampires in 30 Days a Night. They're the really scary monster ones. If you see these vampires, you are going to run. You are not going to be like, that guy's hot, okay? No. They represent this sort of sense of like being afraid of like what the unknown, or like the things that are out there, like leaving your safe zone and exploring things that you don't know, and the fear of what those things can do to you, the fear of encountering the predator out there, the fear of encountering death out there, the fear of even changing and becoming the monster yourself, right? Vampires, you become them often. The next one is the seducer. This is where the vampire took a turn into being attractive, but not being attractive because we had a romantic interest in the vampire. This is the vampire that is like Dracula or the Lost Boys, or some of the vampires in Buffy. Buffy's going to fit a lot of different stages, so we can talk about that. The vampires that are actually killers in Buffy would fit this stage. So these are vampires that are attractive. We look at them and they pull us in, and they're alluring, right? They can be mesmerizing sometimes, but once we get there, once we really see that vampire, then we realize it's a monster. It's not a good guy. It's just visually not. So it pulls us in, but then we have the realizations. This type of vampire is a lot more about temptation and being afraid of our own temptations and the things that we think we want, but we don't realize are really dangerous and could destroy us. We don't run from this vampire. It gets us to let it in, then it destroys us. So it's turned into a choice or an ignorance. We don't see the monster until it's too late. Stage 3 is the moral monster. This is the vampire that is in things like Louis, An Interview with the Vampire, in Fevre Dream. We're going to start talking about this now, so spoilers to come. Joshua York is one of these moral vampires. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel is definitely one. We could argue that Spike he's definitely one by the end. In the middle, you could make an argument. Some of the vampires in Vampire Diaries are also like this, and some of them aren't. This is where there is a society of vampires, and the nature of the vampire is still the stage 2 vampire. They're seducing you in, but their nature is monstrous, and once you let them in, they will kill you. In this stage, there is the one, or maybe a couple, vampires that are trying to be good or that are morally good. They stand out. They're different from the other vampires. They want to change. And this brings up struggles with morality and like, can we fight our nature? Can we choose compassion and goodness over other things like selfishness and violence? Can we resist instinct and be something different? So I think that's some of the fear there and some of the struggle. Are we stuck with being what nature tells us we are? Or can we move beyond it? And also I think in this level, trust comes into it, because can we really trust these types of vampires? Can Buffy really trust Angel? Can Elena really trust Damon or the other, Stefan? Can Abner Marsh really trust Joshua York? They don't know. It's a struggle. We see the danger, but we see some compatibility, we see compassion, and it's a question. I think this brings up the fear of almost faith, right? The fear of seeing the dark aspects of something and trusting them and letting somebody in anyway, and how is that going to turn out for you? And then the last stage would be the intimate vampire. So this is the vampire that we see in something like Twilight. Again, I think the Vampire Diaries fits this one. And I actually think that Fevre Dream, Joshua York fits this one as well. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. It's this vampire that we really are attracted to inside and out, but it's not just attraction. This is the vampire that we get to know, that we build a companionship with, that we love, or that the character loves. I keep saying we because it's like supposed to represent our fears and our psychology, but in the story it's the character doing this. Anyway, so we totally invite this vampire in to our lives and ourselves. We have decided to trust them. Then what dangers are we left with afterwards? Once we're attached and we're willing to sacrifice ourselves or put ourselves in danger knowingly and openly, what are the consequences of that? That's where some of the fear comes in here. It's more representing a fear of the intimate, a fear of close relationships where we become attached to other people. Before we get a little bit deeper into this intimate idea of the vampire, I do want to talk about something else that I think is interesting that has happened along the evolution of the vampire that lends it to being something that we keep going back to. And that's its ability to seduce us, the audience, which I think it has done. Because if we look at that evolution from the vampire that is disgusting, that we run from, to the vampire that is seductive but we know is still evil inside, to the vampire that wants to be moral, to the vampire that's attractive throughout, inside and outside. That is the audience, the viewer, becoming more and more enthralled by the vampire. We wanted the vampire to be good. The vampire is so interesting that we turned them into first the good guy and then the romantic love interest, right? Or at least, I don't know if I want to, I mean, we did do that, but I want to think of it more as like companionship. You'll see when I get to that point. But I think what's even more interesting than just the fact that the vampire was able to seduce the audience so much that that's part of its evolution is also that we never let go of the danger. So what makes it so seducing isn't just the attractiveness quality, but it's the dangerous quality too. And I think it's because we can change that danger. The danger is versatile. We can make it a lot of different things and it still works. And I think part of where you can really see this is in these stories where you're supposed to really like the vampires, but everybody, all the fans, end up loving the vampire who's a little less good. So you have like the really good moral vampire, and then the one who's like not evil, but definitely more willing, more dangerous, more willing to do the wrong thing sometimes. And almost always that's the favorite. So if I think about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it's Spike rather than Angel. If I think about the Vampire Diaries, it's Damon and then Klaus, who's even worse, instead of Stefan. If you think about Interview with the Vampire Chronicles, it's Lestat instead of Louis. Even in Fever Dream, where Julian is so much worse than York, York still isn't a completely moral agent. You see a lot of the horrible things that he has done. So something compels us about the danger of this creature that we have created. That's what's part of what keeps it interesting and keeps it going. It never is the fully moral agent, and I think that's because the tension between morality, between where we sometimes make the wrong choice, is a lot more interesting to people than just the full good. So even when the vampire starts leaning towards being the moral agent, we pull back to the little bit worse vampire because that's where the tension really lies in us. This brings me to another point with the vampire where I see a lot of people complain and talk about, you know, what they're not interested in the vampire. And that's like the vampire as the boyfriend. And so the way that I see this criticism pop up often is this idea that like women have turned the vampire into this sexy boyfriend character and people are sick of that and they think it's boring. And they want to go back to the more interesting, scary vampire. And well, I think it's perfectly legitimate if you just find the scary vampire more interesting. And I find, you know, moral grayness I do find that more interesting as well. So no blame there. But I do want to just touch on this idea that it's like women who have just created this sexy vampire for like the fantasy reason, and that's all it is, and it's a boring, uninteresting sense. Because I actually think Fever Dream is going in that same direction, even though it's not romantic. So usually these boyfriend vampires are compelling and they're a little bit dangerous, but they offer this like mysterious, exciting life, and they're beautiful and they're interesting. And I think we see the exact same thing here, only it's between the relationship with Abner Marsh and Joshua York. Joshua York is beautiful. Abner Marsh talks about his eyes and how he feels in York's eyes all the time. He is compelled by him, and he finds him interesting and mysterious, and they create a relationship which revolves around loyalty and compassion. And Marsh is willing to sacrifice himself to help York. York brings this excitement and this new life to Marsh that Marsh didn't have before and couldn't have without him. I think that what is compelling about the vampire boyfriend is very closely compelling about this story with Joshua York and this friendship that they create. Because in both cases, it's still the idea of creating a relationship with somebody who you're not sure if you can trust, and you have to say, okay, I'm gonna do it, even though you know that there is an element to them that could be dangerous and is scary, right? And I think that's what's compelling in the vampire boyfriend, because the main character is attracted emotionally and physically to the vampire, and they want to see the good in them, and they do see the good in them, but there's still something in the background that's fearful and a little bit distrusting, and they have to sort of learn to trust. And I think that that's the exact same thing that happens with Marsh. And just like in all those vampire boyfriend stories, when we go back and we say, this is what's wrong with it, and this is what's wrong with it, and this would be such a horrible relationship because really the vampire is hurting the partner who's human. That happens in this too. York brings something to Marsh's life. He brings the boat. He brings the excitement of this life that Marsh really wants to have. He brings a partnership and a friendship. Marsh doesn't really have anybody in his life other than York. So he brings all this same stuff to their friendship that is the vampire boyfriend brings to the life of the partner, the human partner in those stories. But he also brings a lot of danger, and he hurts Marsh in a lot of ways and traumatizes him, and his life in some respects becomes destroyed because of the relationship that he has with Marsh. But it's still somewhat romanticized, especially at the end when we see York returning to Marsh's grave over and over again. I had an emotional response to that ending and their friendship, and I think that you're supposed to as a reader. So it's still this sort of romanticized relationship even here with Martin. I think that that helps me get at why the sexy vampire boyfriend isn't, even if you don't like it, like whatever, you don't have to like it, but I just think that it's more interesting and compelling and dynamic and complex than we pretend, and it's not just toxicity, that it's delving into questions about intimacy and relationships and what you give up for another person that is a lot more interesting than just girls' fantasy of a sexy vampire boyfriend. Okay, another thing that I want to talk about with this that I think makes the vampire really interesting and compelling is the different ways that they can be a metaphor, especially a metaphor for the outsider, but in a way that adds a little bit more of a moral and philosophical tension to the idea of the outsider. I think that we can see this in True Blood, although I can't go as in depth into that because I never really got super into True Blood, but I really liked the idea of it, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and then we can see it in Fevre Dream, and that I can get more into. What I'm talking about here is when we see the vampire become like a whole group that is an outsider. The group is outsiders, but they want in. So I think this is really interestingly done in True Blood, where the vampires are actual citizens. They're known, they are in the society interacting, they can go to bars and buy synthetic blood. and they're figuring out how to intertwine into the society of humans. But like I said, I can't go much deeper than just the idea, because I loved the idea, but the execution of True Blood I just wasn't really interested in. I tried to watch this show and I just couldn't do it. We can get into it deeper with Fevre Dream, where Joshua York is taking on a similar path. He wants the vampires to be able to integrate more into society and interact with humanity and not be a predator of humanity. He wants things to come together and for the vampires to be able to have their own piece of society in the world alongside humanity. But where things get complicated is that in these situations, the outsiders that the vampires aren't just other. They're not just different, but they actually have dangerous elements to them that are very clear. So where that philosophical tension comes in, that I think adds to the interest of the story with the vampires in True Blood and in Fevre Dream, is this idea of how do we balance this moral judgment and this acceptance of others, especially if we feel that there's a potential for real danger. And when do we allow the risk? And so I just think that this brings up a whole extra layer to the outsider story that just brings in a more interesting and compelling moral question. That question is really presentable with the vampire. Finally, what I want to end with is Twilight. So everybody will be excited to talk about that, I'm sure. What I want to talk about with Twilight is this idea of the monster not being able to disappear. In Twilight, I think Stephenie Meyer is trying to present the vampire with less danger. Yes, she's admittingly showing dangers of Edward and Bella being together, but in reality, he is supposed to be, at the end of the day, by the end of the story, a force for good in Bella's life. This is a romance. It has a happily ever after. He's supposed to be a good partner who's a good person, who's protective and gives her this exciting life and this life that she really wants to live. And that's the goal for Meyer. And the other vampires are the more monstrous and dangerous ones that they have to really look out for. However, one of the biggest criticisms that you see when people talk about Twilight is this idea that Edward is not that, and not in a way that it even seems like Stephenie Meyer meant for him to be. So yes, she's allowing some fear and some risk with his character as the relationship develops, but I think the risk that she's trying to present is more of a risk of just letting somebody in. It's the basic relationship risk of love and attachment and being able to accept somebody who you can't fully know, which is why Edward can't read Bella's thoughts and they end up being the couple, because he can read everybody else's thoughts. For it to be a real relationship with the fears of a real relationship, he has to not know. He has to take the leap of faith, the same one that she has to take. And so that's what I think Myers is intending to present. But I think what comes out is where we see the criticism of Twilight, and that is that Edward is not protective and good. He's controlling and jealous. He does weird things like watches her when she's asleep without her consent. He always tries to make decisions for her. He doesn't allow her to be her own independent person and make judgments for herself. He wants to make the judgments for her. All of that shows a really negative presence that a lot of people find problematic in the story. My point here is just that I think the nature of the vampire makes it such that it's always gonna be kind of controversial, and there's always gonna be that tension within it, even when you try to make it the moral agent. Stephenie Myers tries to do that, but I still think the fear of being so overpowered in control and possessed by another person, that fear comes alive in the story, even if she didn't mean for it to. And I just think it's really interesting that with a book where a lot of people want to just say, like, it's trash, it's not written well, it's not worth thinking about, it seems the vampire element to it still does add this interesting tension that is worth thinking about and that is presenting the fears of the time. Like, we can't escape the vampire being a symbol for our fear, even when we try to. So anyway, I think it's a lot more interesting to think about what vampires do in different stories rather than to just argue about like which type of vampire we want in the story. There is a place for vampires everywhere because they are always bringing up new interesting ways to think about fear and tension and our struggles, whether the vampire is a sexy boyfriend vampire, a bestie vampire, or a grotesque Nosferatu vampire. They still bring up something compelling when they're in a story. So to me, it's okay. Let them keep evolving. Let them be boyfriends. Let them be whatever it is that is in our minds at the time, because something compelling is going to come out of that if we think about it a little bit. And bringing it back to Fevre Dream, I think one of the most compelling tensions of this story that got brought up for me is that friendship between Marsh and Abner, and the question of, did their friendship make Abner's life better? Was it worth it for Abner to have let Joshua in, even with all the trauma and struggle that Abner had to go throughout his life because of that relationship? So let me know your thoughts. If you agree, disagree, have anything to go off on based on what I said here. And as you can probably tell, I really like vampires, so if you have any suggestions of stories I might not have read that you think I would enjoy, I would love to hear them. Feel free to leave a comment. See ya!